I heard this really strange concept. Something about analog synthesis? What would that be, like analog standard cells? Oh, that's funny. I can imagine that. I mean, could you just imagine this? No library could satisfy could even satisfy a small percentage of cases. With all the different circuits and device sizes, it just sounds crazy. So what are you working on today? I'm doing an op-amp design. I'm doing a high-performance op-amp design. Well, I'm doing a low-power design. So, would you like to hear more about the analog cells and standard cells as part of an analog synthesis? You would? Great! So, when you start to think about sort of synthesis, we immediately start by thinking about what automated design looks like in the digital space. And what starts off as a whole range of high-level concepts that go to Verilog that we compile down and do place and route to layout, all of this becomes just sort of a standard kind of approach, but what drives it is a whole set of standard cells, which are typically logic gates and flip-flops and things that are built around the abstraction. And you think, this is great! And as a result, you can see so many different designs, such that this is just standard practice. Fortunately, when you get to analog IC design, any sort of automation, you're kind of looking at a problem where everyone goes, I got a high-level concept, and somehow I might get to layout, and for the most part, you got question marks everywhere. Rather disappointing. And yet, here's the thought. Imagine if you actually had an analog standard cell library. Imagine where that could get you. Because at that point you think, at least I have some part of a library, and maybe I'm not quite sure how all the pieces play out, but I could start imagining finding some ways to start compiling to fundamental blocks, and I could imagine finding some place and route structures and putting all this together. And so once I can imagine getting that first sort of levels of abstraction right, I might be able to get the rest of the data, the rest of the sort of synthesis path to work. So this is what we're going to talk about over the next several minutes, is what is the first sort of standard cell library, actually done in open source Skywater 130nm CMOS. These are in fab. We are all looking forward to the measurements results, but we want to talk about what we have so far so you can kind of see what's possible. And this has been sort of a collaborative effort with two other individuals, both at University of Mississippi. And it has been a really interesting and amazing effort to get this started, and is the first point along a journey. This person's actually serious about this analog standard cell stuff? Oh, this is strange. Now, remember, there is this discussion about no library could possibly satisfy even a small percentage of cases. Well, to be fair, if you do not have programmability in the analog space, the challenge is really large because there are a large number of parameters to worry about otherwise. But the way past this is to be able to have that programmability and doing a standard CMOS, which is basically these sort of floating gate devices which are well understood in standard CMOS. Now some may even wonder, do these even work? And yes, they do. And we can kind of talk about it briefly. If you talk about a single floating gate circuit, it's usually talking about a transistor, capacitors, maybe specialized capacitances for tunneling junctions to maybe shift charge off. But the key is to have a piece of polysilicon with no contacts. Sometimes you call that an error. That's not what you're having here. But if you look at that transistor, it then just can become just a straight PFET, although typically a thicker insulator PFET in a 130 process to make sure you've got plenty of sort of insulator thickness to make sure that you get your 10-year lifetime storage. You'll have like a capacitor for tunneling to kind of remove charge off. And now this will be usually a very small capacitance of sorts, typically a varactor capacitance. And then you have your main capacitors, which could be either varactor capacitors or even things that you might use overlap capacitances. And all of these are typically things you find in a standard CMOS process. So the person who doesn't think these work is probably just wandering off right now. What this enables, though, is to rethink analog design. And sort of a talk that it was a little over 3 years ago at ISCUS kind of began to approach this as saying there's some key things to think about, both in terms of transistor design, how you begin to sort of move away from op-amp centric design, and how you start to really sort of center on transconductance capacitance design. And these become the core things that allow you to move across the bridge to a new direction, all kind of enabled by configurable techniques. And so what you talk about is integrated circuit design transformed by the programmability. And this really allows you to both use the floating gates for biasing, for setting linearity, for all of the other sort of filter structures without needing banks of passives and so forth in a configurable structure. So this really gets built over many, many years of floating gate based field programmable analog array innovation. And what we find is that over time, a lot of the core blocks really converged. The programmability was essential, and that you could also do some computing and routing. And so the floating gate elements and how they interacted with it was really essential. So those are key things to remember. And so the initial standard cell perspective kind of builds from this because we know we already have an abstractable space. So that abstraction helps us tremendously, and you get significant abstraction even looking at, say, a single bandpass filter block. You have multiple layers of abstraction before getting to some of the basic components that you'd see on the chip. So now you begin to think, well, what IC process did you use to develop the standard cell library? And you can pick many of them. But one of the nice things with the Skywater is the Skywater 130 process. It's open source. We're really enthusiastic about it because with all design files and tools, because it enables a lot of people to use it. Also enables very easy use in classroom and a range of collaborators. And it really then opens up what we mean by standard cells. It gives us, sort of general fabrication platform. Then there's been a whole range of this discussion in terms of things that you see with like a caravan structure, with a processor already on board. And in fact, this really feels very similar to like some of the system-on-chip FPA structures, and it seems like some of these ideas got borrowed in the process. And so, yay, we have a standard cell library, everything sitting at a pitch at 6.5 microns, all completely open and available. It starts with the floating gate elements, and this kind of sets the conversations both of what set the pitch and the core cells. Because what you need to think about here is you've got sort of a crossbar array to work with of multiple floating gates. Typically for the more generic cases, you're talking about indirect programming, but you've also got to notice that the supply lines are running both horizontal and vertically. And that's going to be really important because it's a little different from how typical standard cells will operate, and you have to kind of stretch some of the typical definitions. You certainly have no trouble getting a thicker insulator device for your FETs, so that works great, and that's used for everything that touches a floating gate element. And so what you find is you actually get layouts that's sort of a core 4x2 switch cell. You can also do this for bias cells, but things have this sort of matching. You have some pretty wide gaps in the varactor caps because of the well spacing for tunneling junctions in this generic structure. Clearly there's ways to kind of tighten this up with more data, but this is kind of a good, safe way to kind of build it. And so the 4x2 structure is set up because you want to try to optimize how many devices you can get and minimize this extra well spacing width that you have to deal with. And so after that, you're like, wait, there's a whole bunch of other elements that you can start putting in terms of transconductance amplifiers, caps, a winner-take-all core block, transistors, and so forth. And this really gets set up by actually taking often floating gate components and other block parts and pulling it together into a sort of complex block with a bunch of floating gates and non-floating gate elements in what is sort of an island interface that you kind of have different parts. So when you go island interface, what do you mean? But if you think about it, you actually have places that are the floating gate centric cells. You've got some cells that are completely have no floating gates in them, and sort of middle transition regions with some control structure around it. Each of these islands then can be independent, and I can build them around that. Because you've got two very different ways that you want for the left and the right cell. The right standard cell looks very traditional, where you have VDD and ground on the lines and then routing lines in between. Whereas in the floating gate cells, you've actually got to have both vertical and horizontal lines, like metal 1 and metal 2, to try to make this to kind of fit everything in a tight way. And so now you've got an interesting mixture of how you have to build the structure. And at this, you get the layout for the transconductance amplifiers, just a whole, and they actually turn out, you can see they tend to be very matched. And at that, you get a whole 130 test structure out of this that really tries to use and share all the pins. You can see a really nice layout of it. It's still really tiny in the caravan structure, so much more is possible. And when you look at that, what it means is we've got this huge opportunity of this first standard cell library, and it really is the start of it. And obviously, when I see the experimental results, we're already starting to see how to expand this out, not by a huge amount, but there's some different variations on this in terms of various direct and indirect floating gate structures. Also adding some more analog IC course elements that's actually being connected to course and class development, because everything is all open and contributable. And so there's more transconductances, elements, amplifiers, some comparators, sensor front ends, ADCs, and so on. So you can start to build this into a very structured block. And I'm sure some are going, I still don't believe it, it'll never replace the designers. And the point is, the hope is that we're never going to actually replace the designers, but we increase the impact and increase the awareness of their artistry. And so then I have any questions? And hey, look, lots of questions. This is great. So I'm looking forward to all this, and thank you very much for watching.